2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags on. Join me home to have some fun when the clock strikes 1.
Well, that's the first rock and roll record by Bill Haley and the Comets in the 1950s, Rock Around the Clock. 1950s, chapter 26, Affluence, in the 50s, was known as the baby boom generation. If you were born between 1946 and 1964, like myself, then you were a baby boomer. It was a much simpler time. Hula hoops, slinkies, rock'em sock'em robots, marbles, things that kids probably aren't into as much today. But I remember being a kid in the 50s and 60s, and you could go outside and play. Didn't have to worry about, your parents didn't have to worry about you as long as you were home by dark. When the street lights came on, of course we lived in the country, we didn't have any street lights, but kids in town would, and we'd go out and play baseball all day, hang out in the woods, camp out. Just a good time to be alive. We'd go on vacation, leave the door unlocked, come back a couple days later, and nobody touched a thing. But God forbid you try to do that these days. But in 1952, Eisenhower, who had no political experience at all, and just being in the military and in general, of course, was elected president as a Republican. And he ran against Adlai Stevenson in 52 and won pretty easily. He also won in 56. His running mate was Richard Nixon, who would then run in 1960 against Kennedy and lose, but come back and win in 1968. The 50s also was a time for civil rights. A couple civil rights issues that came up. One was the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case, and in that they ruled that Linda Brown in Topeka, Kansas should be allowed to go to a integrated school. Of course, before that time we had black schools and white schools, and the the Brown family sued, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And what it did is it overturned the 1890s case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which was separate but equal is okay, and the court ruled in the Brown case that although it may be separate, it's not equal. And since that time, we've had integrated, not just integrated schools, but all of society has been integrated. Back then, you had parks that were segregated, you had restaurants, you had hotels, hospitals, everything you can imagine was segregated. We had, of course, the nonviolence movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King, and there was a major bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. King would be part of that because Rosa Parks, I remember, was kicked off the bus. She refused to give up her seat, and she was fined $10, but more than that, it wasn't just the $10 money that was the problem, but it led to a to the bus boycott, where the African Americans in town would not use the city buses. They walked to work, rode bikes, carpooled, and the bus system eventually, after about a year, gave in and hired more black bus drivers, treated African Americans with a little bit more integrity and fairness, and the boycott was successful. He also had a sad situation with Emmett Till, a African-American boy who was from Chicago, went down to Mississippi to visit some family, and he was murdered. And this got a lot of headlines, and it kind of opened up the eyes of many people about just how serious our country needed to be when it came to equality and civil rights. And then in the 1950s, Little Rock, Arkansas was the place where they integrated the Central High School with 9 African American students. They were the only ones out of 2,000 that went to school there. In fact, you can look up some of the pictures online, and there were two in particular, a gal named Hazel and one named Elizabeth. Elizabeth Eckford was the African-American girl, and Hazel was the white gal who was 15 years old that was screaming obscenities at her as she went into the school. But most of the kids ended up graduating from the school, and they went on to lead successful lives. But they had to have President Eisenhower to call in the troops to escort the kids into school because the school district did not want to let that happen. Other things that happened in civil rights, President Truman back in the 1940s would be the first president to desegregate the Army. After the war, the GI Bill was passed, and that allowed many former soldiers to go to school, go to college, go to trade school for free, and that became part of known as the Montgomery Bill later, and that's still in force today. Many people moved from the cities to the suburbs. There was a place called Levittown, which was suburban living at that time. We had a lot of people starting to buy automobiles. The 50s was a time for a great economic time going on, and we had, if you looked at some of the statistics, 1948, for instance, 60% of Americans owned one car in their family. And in 1955, the year I was born, 90% owned one car. In fact, I grew up in a family that was a one-car family for a long time, and my father eventually got a pickup truck too. But, we kind of made it work. It was also a time, because people were buying automobiles, Eisenhower decided that we should spend more money on highways, and we started the interstate highway system where you could drive from the east to west coast. The Federal Highway Act was passed in 1956, and we spent billions of dollars to improve the highways in America. It was also a time when many Americans were deeply religious. In fact, they added, under Eisenhower's term, the under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. 65% of Americans were church members by 1960, and it was certainly a different time period. I think sometimes we look back and we long for the days when we were children because we think it was a better time to live. I'm not so sure if generations today of younger people will have that same feeling, but I think when you talk to people in their 50s and 60s and older and they look back fondly on their years as kids, they do have good memories in many cases. But a couple things to think about before we close here on chapter 26. One is when we look at television shows from the 1950s, and some of you have seen TV Land and Nick at Night and some of these other shows that have reruns of the 50s, Leave It to Beaver and Ozzie and Harriet and some of these shows. And if you're not familiar with them, look at a couple of these shows on YouTube. Do the 50s shows reflect the way families actually were, or not? The last thing to think about is, we integrated schools in America. Do we, I might have touched on this earlier at one point, but do we integrate more today by income than we do race? In other words, when people make more money, they live in the same neighborhoods. When they make less money, they live in the same neighborhoods with other people who make less money. So it's not necessarily split up by race or even religion as much as it is by who can afford to buy a house in that neighborhood. Something to think about.